The moment he walked through the door, the air in the room changed, and I didn't understand why until it was already too late. I still remember that night as if it never left me, like it was carved into the quiet hours of my life and refuses to fade no matter how many days pass. I was working my usual shift at the diner on the corner of Madison Street, the kind of place where the coffee is always slightly burnt and the booths have seen more broken conversations than happy endings. My name is Emily Carter, and I was just trying to get through another late evening, balancing trays, memorizing orders, smiling at customers who barely looked up long enough to notice me. Nothing about that night was supposed to be different. Until he arrived. The bell above the door rang softly, but somehow it felt louder than it should have, like even sound was careful around him. He stepped inside alone, and I noticed immediately that he didn't belong there. Not because he looked out of place in the physical sense, but because everything about him carried weight. He wore a dark coat, simple but perfectly tailored, and his presence made the small diner feel smaller. People didn't stare at him directly, they just shifted, subtly, like instinct was telling them to give space. I didn't know his name yet, but I would later learn it was Ethan Cole. At that moment, he was just a man who chose a corner booth instead of the counter, sitting down with a calmness that didn't match the restless energy of everyone else in the room. I remember walking over with a menu in my hand, trying to ignore the strange feeling in my chest that I couldn't explain. He looked up when I reached his table, and for a second, I forgot what I was supposed to say. His eyes were steady, unreadable, not cold exactly, but controlled in a way that made me feel like he saw more than he should. "What can I get you?" I asked, forcing my voice to stay normal. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he studied me for a moment longer than necessary, like my question was not the most important part of the exchange. Then he ordered something simple, almost too simple, like he wasn't really there for the food at all. I wrote it down, but I could feel his attention still on me, even when I turned slightly to leave. The diner kept moving around us, plates clinking, conversations fading in and out, but there was a strange stillness at his table, as if time had slowed down in that one corner of the room. I told myself not to overthink it. People come and go every day. That's what I believed then. But when I looked back a few minutes later, I saw him still watching the room quietly, not as a customer waiting for his order, but as someone observing patterns no one else could see. I didn't know it yet, but that was the first moment my ordinary life began to tilt into something I could never return from. The second time I saw him, I understood something had already shifted inside me, even though nothing had technically changed on the surface. It was the next evening, same shift, same diner, same routine that usually made the hours blur together into nothing important. But I remember slowing down when I noticed the corner booth was no longer empty. Ethan Cole was there again. He was sitting in the exact same position as the night before, like he had chosen that specific place with intention rather than convenience. I tried to convince myself it was a coincidence, but something about the way he sat made it feel like coincidence was too simple an explanation. When I approached his table, I felt that same strange pressure in the air again, like the room adjusted itself around him without asking permission. "You came back," I said before I could stop myself, and immediately regretted how it sounded, too personal for a waitress speaking to a customer. He looked up at me slowly, as if my words required careful consideration. "I did," he replied simply, his voice calm, but carrying a quiet certainty that made it sound like every choice he made had already been decided long before the moment arrived. I forced a polite smile and asked if he wanted the same order, trying to return the interaction back into something normal, something safe. He nodded once, and I wrote it down again, but this time my hand felt slightly slower, like my focus was splitting between the notepad and the person sitting in front of me. I noticed small things I had missed before. The way he never looked at his phone. The way he scanned the room without moving his head too much. The way people avoided lingering near his table even when they were not consciously aware of doing it. It was subtle, but it was there, like an invisible boundary no one had agreed on, but everyone respected anyway. When I brought his order out, I placed it carefully on the table, and for a brief second, our hands were close enough that I felt a strange awareness of space I could not explain. He didn't touch the food immediately. Instead, he looked at me again, and this time his gaze lingered longer than the night before. "Do you always work this late?" he asked, as if the question mattered more than it should. I hesitated before answering. "Most nights," I said. It is just part of the job. He nodded slightly, as if storing the information somewhere I could not see. Then he said something that stayed with me long after I walked away from the table. People who stay in the same place too long usually stop noticing when something new enters it. I did not fully understand what he meant, but I felt it anyway, like a warning wrapped in a calm observation. The rest of my shift passed normally on the surface, but I kept finding myself glancing toward the corner booth without meaning to, noticing how he never truly blended into the background, even when he was still. And somewhere between refilling coffee cups and clearing plates, I realized I was starting to anticipate his presence more than I wanted to admit. The city felt quieter after their last conversation, as if even the streets outside the small diner were waiting for something neither of them had admitted yet. Inside, she moved through her shift with careful precision, carrying trays, wiping counters, and keeping her eyes down whenever the bell above the door rang. But she could feel it before she saw it, the shift in energy that always followed him. When he entered, he did not announce himself. He never needed to. The room seemed to recognize him first, conversations softening, movements slowing, as if time itself adjusted its pace. He chose the same corner booth again, the one where reflections in the window made it seem like he was both inside and outside the world at once. She told herself she would keep it professional, that nothing about him should interrupt her routine, yet her hands betrayed her with the slightest hesitation as she poured coffee into a plain white cup and walked toward him. He looked up only once, but that single glance was enough to make the air between them feel heavier, like it carried unspoken words neither of them had prepared to say out loud. She placed the cup down carefully, her fingers brushing the edge of the table for balance, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Outside, a car passed slowly along the street, headlights stretching across the floor like pale lines of warning, but inside the diner everything remained suspended in quiet tension. He finally thanked her, his voice calm but deliberate, as if every word had been chosen with care long before it was spoken. She nodded, stepping back too quickly, telling herself to focus on the other tables, the other customers, anything that would anchor her back into the normal rhythm of her life. Yet her attention kept drifting back, against her will, to the corner booth where he sat without touching his food, as if he was there for a reason deeper than hunger. He observed everything, the exits, the people, the patterns of movement, but when his gaze returned to her it softened in a way that did not match the rest of him. She noticed small details she did not want to notice, the patience in his silence, the absence of distraction in his focus, the strange contrast between control and restraint. When her shift supervisor called for her from behind the counter, she almost felt relief, but even as she turned away, she sensed his attention following her. Later, when the diner grew quieter and the evening lights outside became brighter than the sun had been, she found herself returning to his table under the excuse of clearing empty dishes. He looked up again, and this time the silence between them held longer than before. It was not comfort exactly, but it was no longer unfamiliar either. Something unspoken had begun to form in that space, fragile and uncertain, as if both of them were standing at the edge of a decision they had not yet agreed to make. And when he finally stood to leave, placing folded cash beneath the cup, he paused just long enough to say that he would return, not as a question, but as a statement that did not require permission. The days after his last visit did not return to normal the way she expected them to. Instead, they stretched into something heavier, as if time itself had slowed down every hour she spent working at the diner. She told herself not to think about him, but the mind rarely listens when it has already recognized something it cannot easily categorize. Every shift began the same way now, with the sound of the bell above the door creating a brief moment of tension that passed through her like a quiet pulse of anticipation. He did not come every day, but the uncertainty of his return was almost more persistent than his presence itself. On the third evening after he had said he would return, she found herself glancing toward the entrance more often than necessary, pretending it was part of her routine duties. When he finally appeared again, it was later than usual, just as the streetlights outside began to glow brighter than the fading daylight. He entered without hesitation, as if the space had been waiting for him rather than the other way around. This time, he did not immediately sit. Instead, he paused near the counter, looking around the diner with a calm awareness that made everything feel slightly more exposed. She approached him because it was her job, but there was something different in her steps, something she did not fully understand yet. He ordered nothing at first, only asked for water, as if the act of being there mattered more than anything else. When she returned with the glass, he spoke quietly, asking her name again, even though she had already told him days earlier. It was not forgetfulness, but a way of listening that made her feel noticed in a way she was not used to. She answered again, slower this time, and he repeated it once under his breath as if confirming it for himself. The diner around them continued its usual rhythm, forks tapping plates, chairs scraping lightly, background conversations rising and falling like waves that never reached their table. But between them, something more focused was forming, not loud, not dramatic, but deliberate. He asked small questions, nothing invasive, only fragments of curiosity about her routine, her hours, the quiet life she had built around this place. She answered cautiously at first, then more naturally, as if the act of speaking to him began to feel less like a risk and more like an unexpected familiarity. When her supervisor called for her again, she stepped away quickly, but she noticed how he did not look away from her even once while she moved across the floor. Later, when the diner began to empty and the night pressed closer against the windows, she returned to his table with the excuse of checking if he needed anything else. He said no, but he did not leave. Instead, he remained seated, watching the quiet movement of the emptying room, as if he was measuring something invisible in the atmosphere. When he finally stood to leave again, there was a brief pause that felt longer than it should have, and before walking out, he said that consistency mattered more than coincidence, leaving her standing with words she could not immediately place but could not forget either. The diner had begun to change in subtle ways she could not easily explain, even though nothing visible about it was different. The same booths remained in place, the same counter still reflected the same dull glow of overhead lights, and the same clock on the wall continued its steady movement without interruption. Yet she felt a shift every time he entered, as if the space itself recalibrated around his presence. It was not fear, and it was not comfort, but something in between that made her more aware of details she used to ignore. On the following evening, she arrived early for her shift, telling herself it was only to prepare properly, but part of her knew she was checking something she did not want to admit. When the bell above the door finally rang, she felt the same quiet tension rise inside her before she even turned around. He was there again, dressed. Simply, blending in just enough to avoid attention from anyone who was not already paying attention. He chose a different booth this time, closer to the window, where reflections layered the interior with faint images of the outside street. She approached him with practiced professionalism, but there was less distance in her movements than before, a change so small it might have gone unnoticed by anyone else. He greeted her with a slight nod rather than words, as if conversation was no longer required to acknowledge familiarity. When she placed the water down, he did not immediately look at it, instead watching her face with a calm patience that made her briefly forget her next task. He asked a question that seemed simple on the surface, about how long she had worked there, but the way he asked made it feel like something more layered underneath. She answered honestly, and he listened without interruption, as if every detail mattered more than it should. Around them, the diner continued its quiet cycle of movement, but their table felt separated from it, as if placed slightly outside of time. Later, when the rush had faded and the evening settled into near silence, he remained seated longer than usual. She cleaned nearby tables while occasionally glancing in his direction, noticing how he observed not just her, but everything around her with steady attention. When she finally returned to his table to clear empty dishes, he spoke again, this time without asking a question first, stating that patterns always revealed intention if observed long enough. The words stayed with her even after she walked away, because they sounded less like casual conversation and more like something measured and deliberate. As his visit ended and he left the diner without any unusual scene or attention from others, she stood behind the counter longer than necessary, realizing that nothing about her night felt ordinary anymore, even though everything had technically remained the same. The next time she saw him, she noticed something different in the way he entered the diner, not in appearance, but in intention. The bell above the door rang as usual, yet she felt the sound more sharply than before, as if she had already been expecting it. He chose his seat without hesitation, but this time his attention was not immediately on her or on the room. Instead, he paused for a moment, looking out through the window as though confirming something beyond the street outside. She continued her work, trying to maintain the rhythm of her shift, but she found herself noticing more about him than she intended to. The way he remained still when others moved, the way he observed without appearing to search, and the way his presence seemed to create structure in what had otherwise been an ordinary evening. When she approached his table, she expected the usual brief exchange, but instead he asked her something unexpected, a question about whether she had ever considered leaving the city. The question was simple, yet it landed heavily because it did not belong to the context of a casual diner conversation. She paused before answering, uncertain why she felt the need to be more careful with her words than usual. She told him she had thought about it, like most people do at some point, but that she had never made any real plans. He listened without interruption, his expression unchanged, but his silence felt more intentional than passive. Around them, the diner continued its steady rhythm, but their conversation seemed to exist slightly apart from it, as if it were unfolding in a quieter layer of reality. Later that night, as the shift began to wind down, she noticed him still sitting in the same place long after his cup had been emptied. When she finally returned to clear the table, he looked up and said that people often confuse stability with safety and repetition with choice. The words were not said with force, but they carried weight that lingered after she walked away. She found herself thinking about them while wiping down counters and closing out registers, trying to focus on routine tasks while her mind kept returning to the same idea. When his visit ended and he left without drawing attention from anyone else, she realized that nothing about her understanding of her own life felt as fixed as it had before, even though nothing visible in her world had actually changed. The evening began like any other, with the diner settling into its familiar rhythm of soft conversations, clinking dishes, and the steady hum of routine that never fully disappeared even during the slow hours. She arrived for her shift slightly earlier than usual, telling herself it was only to organize her station, but the truth felt more complicated than that, even if she refused to define it. When the bell above the door finally rang, she did not immediately look up, yet she felt the shift in atmosphere before she confirmed it with her eyes. He was there again, stepping inside with the same calm presence that seemed unaffected by the passing noise of the city outside. This time, he did not immediately choose his usual seat. Instead, he paused near the entrance for a brief moment, as if observing the entire room before deciding where to place himself within it. She continued her work, but her attention moved with him in ways she did not openly acknowledge, tracking his movement without breaking her routine. When he eventually sat down, it was in a different booth than before, one slightly farther from the counter, positioned where the reflections from the window overlapped the interior lights. She approached him with the same professional tone she had always used, yet there was a subtle awareness in her posture that had not been there at the beginning. He greeted her simply, but there was a noticeable difference in the pace of his voice, slower, as if he was not in any hurry to fill the silence between them. When she placed his drink on the table, he did not immediately speak, and the pause felt longer than it should have in a normal exchange between a customer and a server. He eventually asked her whether she had ever noticed how people rarely choose their routines consciously, even though they defend them as if they were decisions made with intention. The question lingered in her mind longer than she expected, because it did not feel like small talk, yet it was not something she could easily categorize as anything else. She answered carefully, saying that routines often come from necessity rather than choice, and he nodded as if her response confirmed something he had already been considering. Around them, the diner remained unchanged, but the space between their conversations felt increasingly structured, as if each interaction was building on something unspoken that neither of them had named. Later, when the evening slowed and most customers had left, he remained seated longer than usual, not distracted by his phone or by the environment, simply present in a way that felt deliberate. When she returned to check on his table, he said that people often mistake repetition for stability, but sometimes repetition is only the absence of interruption. The words were quiet, but they stayed with her even after she moved away to clean the counter and prepare for closing. When he finally stood to leave, there was no unusual gesture, no dramatic pause, only a calm departure that felt consistent with everything else about him. Yet as she watched him exit through the glass door and disappear into the street outside, she realized that her understanding of what was ordinary had shifted again, and she could no longer tell where routine ended and something else began. The final evening began without any sense that it would be different from the others. Yet something in the atmosphere of the diner felt slightly more settled, as if an invisible pattern had already been established and was now continuing on its own. She arrived on time for her shift, moving through her usual tasks with practiced efficiency, preparing the counter, checking supplies, and greeting the early customers with polite routine that required no extra thought. But even as she worked, she noticed that her attention kept drifting toward the entrance more often than necessary, not because she expected anything unusual, but because her awareness had quietly adjusted itself over time without her permission. When the bell above the door finally rang, she did not need to look immediately to know who had entered, because the shift in energy inside the room felt familiar now, almost predictable in a way that unsettled her more than surprise ever had. He stepped inside with the same calm presence, but there was something slightly different in his pace, as if he was not simply returning to a place but completing a pattern that had been forming across multiple visits. Instead of choosing his usual seat, he walked further than before and selected a table that placed him closer to the center of the diner, where more of the room could be observed at once. She followed him with her eyes only briefly before resuming her work, reminding herself that nothing about this was outside the boundaries of normal interaction, even if it no longer felt entirely ordinary. When she approached his table, the exchange between them began as it always did, with simple words and controlled distance. But the silence between those words had become more structured, as if each pause now carried meaning rather than emptiness. He asked her a question about decisions, not in a direct or demanding way, but in a tone that suggested he had already thought about the answer before she spoke. He said that most people do not recognize the moment when they begin to accept patterns as identity, and she responded carefully, choosing her words with more awareness than she used to, because she had learned that his questions rarely existed without purpose. Around them, the diner functioned exactly as it always had, yet she could no longer experience it in the same way, because her perception of repetition had changed over the course of these visits. Later, when the night grew quieter and only a few customers remained, he stayed seated longer than usual, observing the space with the same steady attention that never seemed distracted or unfocused. When she returned to his table, he spoke without looking up immediately, saying that continuity is often mistaken for comfort, when in reality it is simply what remains when nothing interrupts it. The statement did not feel like advice, and it did not feel like judgment, but it stayed with her in a way that made her pause longer than she should have while cleaning nearby tables. When he finally left, there was no change in his manner, no indication that anything significant had concluded, only a calm exit that matched every previous visit. Yet as she watched him disappear into the night outside the diner, she realized that the most important change had never been in his behavior, but in the fact that she now noticed patterns where she once only saw routine, and that recognition itself had already altered everything.